Alright, welcome back to another monthly recap video. Today, I'm going to be recapping every single album that I listened to in March. As always, I'm going to be giving a couple sentences about every album, just quick thoughts. These aren't meant to be full, in-depth reviews. But yeah, I've been doing this for every month of the year so far. It's been fun, and we're going to continue it. Starting it off with the first album here, we have College Park by Logic. I feel like ultimately Logic is getting less corny by the day. There's still some moments on this where his humor doesn't really land, but for the most part, he's pretty likable on it. There's some pretty quality old school production and a couple legendary features as well to ultimately make this feel like a Logic album worth listening to. Aside from some highlights like Cracker Island and New Gold, this album just kind of feels safe. Safe isn't usually a word I associate with Gorillaz music, which is why this is ultimately my least favorite album that I've heard from them so far. This debut by the Killers feels extremely dated at times with the synth sounds being used, but overall it's a pretty solid debut because of the passionate performances and the earworm riffs and hooks. This album is pretty inconsistent and messy, but there is some extremely high highs every once in a while. Dawn is just such a unique vocalist on this album. The way he kind of woozily glides through these beats is really special. The production is also kind of familiar but intriguing. It feels kind of Travis Scott psychedelic trap adjacent, but never too much to the point where it feels derivative of Travis. Overall, it could be cut down to a tighter track list, but it's not a bad project at all. J Dilla's Donuts is a perfect example of what an instrumental hip-hop album should be. Low-key, yet colorful, eclectic, varied, smooth flows between tracks, and never staying with one idea for too long. And while I don't love every track here, there's enough variety for there to be at least a handful of tracks for everyone to enjoy. It's really a classic. This one took a little bit to grow on me. It took me like the first 4 listens to really appreciate it. There's still some moments I don't love, but I do appreciate Caroline's kind of soaring vocals a lot more. The production can feel a little bit cheesy at times, but overall it is pretty ambitious and a pretty solid pop album. This is easily the best album I've heard this year. It's anxiety inducing, it's tension building, and it's blood curdling. It's like LCD Sound System meets Daughters in the best way possible. And this is an album that kind of grew off me. I was loving it on the first couple listens, but now a lot of the tracks just feel kind of directionless, and they just feel like they kind of meander too much, not really knowing what they're going for. Overall, I do enjoy the kind of ethereal soundscapes, the guitar feedback, the guitar effects, but overall the tracks just kind of lack an interesting structure. Yeah, good riddance is right. There's absolutely nothing interesting or original about this album. Gracie Abrams here is literally just a Phoebe Bridgers clone that lacks any of the songwriting talent or vocal chops to create anything on the same level as Phoebe. Overall, it's just super derivative, uninspired, and just lacks originality, completely lacks originality. Man, why do so many generic pop singers rely on vocal fry so much? If you don't know what vocal fry is, it's basically this kind of effect to your voice. It's not flattering, it's not impressive, it doesn't make you sound cool, it just sounds terrible. And Khalid does that a lot on this album, and it's generic, it's bland, it's painfully boring, and yeah, it's pretty bad. Billy really does have one of the most memorable voices in the modern pop scene, but the production is really where this album falters the most. It can be quirky and fun at its best, but at its worst, it's overly edgy, tacky, and gimmicky. I would have loved this album a lot more if we got more of those stripped back tracks like I Love You and Goodbye. Those just feel a lot more mature. But instead, we got atrocities like You Should See Me in a Crown and All the Good Girls Go to Hell. Kind of blows my mind that this was made in 2017. It sounds like it could come straight out of the Souvlaki era, but it never sounds outdated either. I guess that just shows how timeless and genius Slow Dive's music is. I didn't think it could get any worse than Neo Theater. It did. I don't really have anything to say about AJR that hasn't been said before, but this is like genuinely the worst album I've ever heard in my life. And on top of that, the vocalist, what's his name? Ryan? Is that what it is? I don't know. The vocalist just had to go and ruin The Office too. Why? Why'd you have to bring the office into this? Come on. While Slowthai does wear his emotions on his sleeve with this album, I just wish he would kind of write about these emotions with a little bit more substance and depth. This is definitely Slowthai's most interesting album musically, but the writing for me is really where it falls flat. There's something so psychedelic about the sensuality on this album. The writing has this psychedelic and surrealist aesthetic. The line, "The mirror's on my ceiling so I can watch you top me," is a great example of this. And of course, Callie sounds great here. Her voice just glides over these instrumentals like butter, and her melodies are just completely engaging and enamoring, and they just pull me into the world of this psychedelic kind of love trip, I guess you could call it. It's amazing. Go listen to it. Yeah, I made a video on this. Go check that out if you haven't, if you want detailed thoughts, but this is awful. This is awful. This is what has Eminem done? That's basically all I can say. Eminem, you've kind of ruined rap in a way. Just like the cover of this, which is blurred because I don't know if I can show it on YouTube, but this is a striking, memorable, and unsettling project. The album is made up of some pretty simple song structures. It's usually just 2 verses, but it's carried by the Alchemist disorienting and cerebral production, and the 2 vocalists' kind of unrelenting flows and lyrical density. This is one of the most interesting hip-hop projects I've heard in a long time. This is the least annoying 1975 album I've heard so far, but that's not saying much. Matty Healy is still completely insufferable here with his squeaky, overdone, and kind of whiny vocals. The project does have a few catchy moments here and there, but that's about all I can give it. Every track on this thing has some decent production and writing, but none of the songs are well fleshed out enough for them to be memorable. It also just kind of tends to be one-dimensional lyrically, with Kota kind of just talking about the same things for every single track. There's potential here, but I would like to see some of these ideas kind of fleshed out more. What this album lacks in focus, it makes up for with an unrelenting display of personality and charm, a wide range of musical styles, and some pretty witty lyrics. This is definitely Denzel's most inconsistent album when it comes to his rapping. The flows generally are more one-dimensional. There's some really shaky melodic rap performances, and you can just tell that he's a much less polished rapper than he is now. Overall, it's still pretty good. The production and lyricism is still amazing. It just kind of falls a little bit flat in terms of the performances. This is a musical collage unlike anything I've heard. Macklemore's vulnerability on this album is usually overshadowed by some awful features, tacky production, and just terrible, outright terrible attempts at making pop music. It's really not great. It hurts to say this, but this is not very great. It's definitely Denzel's worst project I've heard. The production is pretty cheap. The use of autotune on Denzel's voice comes across as awkward most of the time. And the writing is easily the worst out of any Denzel project. Caesar's warm and welcoming vocal timbre is ultimately overshadowed by some uninspired writing and a lack of melodic variation. The occasional attempts at kind of minimal and ethereal production doesn't really do much for me either, as these attempts usually come across as bland and flavorless. This is just a boom bap essential that paints a super vivid picture of the harsh reality that these guys were living every single day. The Alchemist is quickly becoming one of my favorite producers. His menacing, raw, and kind of extremely textured beats are just pure ear candy. However, Kanye's lack of topical diversity is really where this project falters. You're getting a lot of the same stuff lyrically here, track to track, which isn't the worst thing ever, just considering how cold-blooded it is. But that definitely is my biggest complaint with the album. Oh, why did I listen to this? Why did I listen to this? This is a completely soulless album with 2 lifeless vocalists, uninspired guitar work, and an atmosphere that is just way too bland to make up for the skeletal and minimal approach of a lot of these songs. It's awful. Despite some fuzzy guitar tones and muddy mixing that can kind of occasionally neuter the energy of this album, the musicianship is really where this shines through. The grooves are hypnotic, the transitions between sections are seamless, and the overall arrangement of the 2 tracks makes for a journey that is winding and thrilling. This is a wildly experimental krautrock record that ultimately suffers from kind of a disjointed track flow. This album is great instrumentally. The eclectic drums mixed with a wide variety of synths creates some really interesting soundscapes. I just can't stand the vocals. The vocals aren't always terrible, but when Fever Ray gets higher in their vocal range, They kind of just seem like they're being forced out, the vocals, and it creates some really painful and kind of ear-piercing moments. Each track on this album has a great push and pull effect, with poppy and catchy choruses kind of interspersed with expansive and progressive sections. My major gripes with this album come from the clashing between the electronics and acoustics, and the vocal performances that can often feel choppy and empty. While this album is recorded and mixed well, it ultimately just feels kind of like a derivative kind of ripoff of Radiohead. While this is more straightforward than their previous effort, this album still offers what made Eves, is that how you say it? Eves? Yeah, Eves great in the past, while combining it with more instantaneously memorable and simple songs. There's also more of an emphasis on kind of punk aesthetics, and Eves integrates this with his usual kind of psychedelic guitars and synths really seamlessly. This is the most fun album I've heard this year so far. It's my first time listening to a 100 gecs album, and it's honestly a lot more out there, crazy, and experimental than I thought it would be. I didn't expect this kind of punk rock influenced album with some metal tossed in there as well. I was kind of just expecting a standard hyperpop album. It's basically ADHD in music form, and that's what makes it so memorable and likable. I also love that it isn't just relying on shock factor either. The riffs are genuinely great. The production and mixing is stellar. The live drums, they might not be live, but they sound live. They're punchy, and the melodies are always just super lively and colorful. I'm blown away by this thing. It's amazing. With all the recent like cheap attempts at recreating kind of the 80s sound, it's really refreshing to get a quality 80s kind of disco throwback. This album feels like it honors that sound while also creating something new and modern at the same time. Yeah, this thing was fun for like the first 4 tracks, but then it just got so mind-numbingly repetitive and boring to the point where it felt like a chore to get through. Also, the punk rock track, hilariously bad, but hilarious either way. I probably would have enjoyed this more if I hadn't heard 10,000 gecs before, but compared to that, this one just feels a little tame. I actually think this one has more kind of complete and fleshed out songs, but it lacks the diversity and the absurdity of 10,000 gecs. And the second last album, Scaring the Hose, just did a video on this. Go check it out if you haven't. I feel like with this album and LP, Peggy's project before, he's really proven that he can make beats that are still unique, sporadic, glitchy, that still have that Peggy sound, while making them more digestible. And even though this production is more digestible for me on this album, Danny and Peggy don't cut corners at all vocally. They both deliver exciting, absurd, and memorable vocal performances. Danny does occasionally get outperformed by Peggy, but in the grand scheme of things, they do feel like they are both kind of bringing their A game here. This is easily the most forward-thinking hip-hop album of the year, and it somehow lived up to the insane amount of hype it garnered in its rollout. Alright, and the last album of the video, Live at Bush Hall by Black Country New Road. For an album that was made in kind of a transitional period for the band, this is an extremely promising album. It's not as good as their previous 2 albums, but it's up to par with everything that they've made in the past. It looks like they're gonna continue straying away from the angsty kind of post-punk sound of For the First Time, and more lean into that kind of Arcade Fire inspired, as one of the members of the band puts it, the epic sad sound of Ants From Up There. This one's a little bit less sad than Ants From Up There though, definitely. I feel like you are losing a little bit of that edge with the departure of Isaac, but they are kind of replacing it with a little bit more positivity that feels... It doesn't feel like it's not genuine in any way. It feels like genuine positivity and happiness. In terms of the actual music, the musicality, the arrangement, the emotion is all still there, even with Isaac departing. And most importantly, the heart of the band seems like it's still intact with this album. There is some weak spots in terms of the vocalists. I think Lewis is the weakest vocalist out of the 3. I think Tyler Hyde and May Kershaw are definitely better when it comes to vocals, so I'd like to see them kind of take on the reins of doing the vocals down the road. I'm not saying Lewis can't improve. He can improve, but for right now, I feel like he's the weakest out of the 3. But overall, I'm super excited to see what the band does in the future, especially with a studio album, because this is obviously a live album. It sounds great for being live, but I'm really excited to hear what they can do in a studio album. So yeah, the future of Black Country New Road is looking promising, And overall, this one was not perfect, but pretty solid. And there you go. That was all the albums I listened to in March. How many was that? Was that 40-ish? Hold on. That was 40 albums. There you go. Yeah, hopefully you guys enjoyed this. Let me know your thoughts down below, as always. And yeah, just keep in mind, it's just my opinion. You can disagree. You can tell me if you disagree down below. I love to hear it. And yeah, I will see you guys at the end of April. Right, that's the month that comes after March. Big brain. Smart guy right here. All right, peace out.